Dry Creek was the kind of town that remembered everything and forgave almost nothing. It sat low against the open plains, its buildings worn thin by wind and time, its people hardened by loss and survival. In Dry Creek, reputations were decided quickly and rarely reconsidered. Once a man was labeled, he carried that name like a shadow. Elias Crowe knew this better than most. He lived beyond the last fence on the western edge of town, where the land turned rough and quiet swallowed everything. He was a widower, though no one spoke of his wife anymore. He was scarred, both across his hands and somewhere deeper no one could see. He worked his ranch alone, spoke only when necessary, and left town before conversations could linger. Some called him strange, others called him cold, most simply didn't care enough to look closer. So when sickness came through Dry Creek that spring, no one expected Elias Crowe to matter at all. The fever moved fast, leaving 2 graves behind the church and 5 children standing in the dust with nowhere to go. Their parents were buried before the youngest fully understood what death meant. The town gathered that Sunday, filling the pews with murmured concern and careful distance. "They can't stay here," one man said. "We don't have the means," another added. "Best send them east," the preacher offered gently. "An orphan house will take them." The children sat together in the back pew, pressed shoulder to shoulder like frightened animals. The oldest boy stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes daring anyone to come closer. A small girl beside him wiped her face with a torn sleeve, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. No one noticed Elias Crowe standing near the doorway. He had come only to pay his respects. He had no intention of speaking. He never did, but something about the way the children huddled together, silent, bracing for loss they couldn't stop, held him in place. "I'll take them." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the room. Heads turned slowly, then someone laughed. You can barely look after yourself. A man like you raising children?" Elias didn't flinch. He stepped forward, knelt in front of the children, and met their eyes one by one. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady. "You won't be sent away." The laughter faded, replaced by uneasy silence. The preacher hesitated. "Elias, are you certain?" Elias stood. "Yes." There was no speech, no promise of ease, only a decision. The town watched as Elias Crowe led 5 orphaned children out of the church, already convinced it would end in failure. They whispered as he passed. They shook their heads. But Elias didn't hear them. For the first time since he'd buried his wife, he felt something heavier than grief settle onto his shoulders. Responsibility. And he carried it home. If you are still with me, friend, I hope you hit the subscribe button, so you do not miss what happens next. Grab a cup of tea or coffee. Settle. And tell me in the comments what time it is for you right now. And where you're listening from. The laughter followed Elias Crowe all the way out of the church. It spilled onto the wooden steps and into the street, riding the wind like dust. Elias kept his eyes forward as the 5 children trailed behind him, their small boots scraping against the hard-packed earth. He could feel the weight of every stair pressed against his back. Dry Creek had already made up its mind. Won't last a month. He doesn't know the first thing about children. They'll come crawling back. The oldest boy heard it too. His shoulders tightened, his steps quickened, as if bracing for a blow that hadn't yet landed. Elias slowed just enough to place a hand on the boy's shoulder, not gripping, not guiding, simply there. "You're safe," he said quietly. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't pull away. Elias's house sat beyond the edge of town, past the last fence where the land grew stubborn and quiet. It was small, built for one man and his silence. A single room, a patched roof, a table worn thin by years of solitary meals. The children stopped at the threshold, staring as though the walls might close in on them. "This is home," Elias said. The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue. That first night unraveled quickly. One child refused to eat. Another cried until her voice went hoarse. The youngest woke screaming, flailing in terror Elias didn't know how to name, let alone stop. He tried water, tried food, tried silence. Nothing worked. At some point, Elias sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and stayed there. He didn't leave when the crying came. He didn't leave when exhaustion weighed heavy on his bones. He stayed until the screams softened into whimpers, and the whimpers faded into sleep. By morning, he hadn't slept at all. The days that followed were no easier. Elias burned meals he'd cooked 1,000 times without trouble. He forgot names. He forgot small comforts that should have come naturally. The children watched him carefully, as if waiting for him to admit he'd made a mistake. They tested him, not with misbehavior, but with expectation. "Will you send us away too?" Each morning, Elias rose before the sun. He fixed breakfast. He opened the door. He stayed. The town noticed. They watched for signs of neglect, for proof of failure. When the children came into town clean and fed, suspicion replaced concern. "Pride," they said. But it wasn't pride that kept Elias from asking for help. It was fear. Fear that if he faltered even once, Dry Creek would take the children from him. Fear that kindness, once withdrawn, would never return. One afternoon, as Elias hammered a loose board back into place, the smallest girl stepped closer. "Are you going to leave us?" she asked, barely louder than the wind. Elias set the hammer down. "No," he said. It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a vow. The house did not know how to be loud. It had been built for one man and his silence, for evenings that ended early and mornings that began before light. Now it held 5 children who did not yet know how to trust quiet. Every sound felt too sharp: footsteps, dropped cups, sudden laughter that stopped as quickly as it started, as if even joy was something to be careful with. Elias Crowe learned quickly that caring for children was not like tending land or animals. There was no clear measure of success, no straight lines, only patience stretched thin and tested daily. The oldest boy, Samuel, watched Elias with guarded eyes. He took responsibility where none had been asked of him, standing between Elias and the younger children as if daring the man to prove himself unworthy. Samuel rose early, helped without being told, and slept lightly, ready to wake at the first sign of trouble. Elias saw it. He didn't correct it, not yet. The middle children tested in quieter ways. One refused to speak unless necessary. Another asked the same questions over and over, searching for answers Elias didn't always have. The youngest followed him everywhere, small fingers brushing his coat sleeve, as if needing proof he was still real. At night, the nightmares came. Elias woke to sobbing, sometimes screaming. He fumbled through words meant to soothe, his voice low and unsure. He sat beside beds until the children slept again, long after his own body begged for rest. He never left the room. The town continued to watch from a distance. They waited for shouting, for bruises, for hunger. When none came, they found new reasons to doubt. A man like Elias Crowe, they said, didn't have warmth in him. Didn't have love to give. They were wrong, but not entirely. Love did not come easily to Elias. It arrived in small, awkward pieces. In the way he fixed a broken chair without complaint. In the way he placed an extra blanket over a child already asleep. In the way he learned each name, each fear, each small habit, committing them to memory like maps he refused to lose. One evening, after a day gone badly wrong, a burned supper, a spilled bucket, a shouted word Elias regretted the moment it left his mouth. He sat alone at the table, head bowed. He waited for the children to pull away. They didn't. Instead, Samuel approached quietly and placed a cracked tin cup in front of him. Inside was water, nothing more. "You forgot to drink," the boy said. Elias looked up, startled. Something loosened in his chest. That night, for the first time, laughter broke free, brief and surprised, but real. It startled all of them. The house seemed to hold its breath, unsure what to do with the sound. Elias smiled before he could stop himself. And in that moment, the house began to change. It learned how to hold noise. It learned how to breathe. Slowly, without announcement, it began to feel less like a shelter, and more like a home. Dry Creek had learned to wait. The town had waited for the fever to pass, for the graves to settle, for grief to fade into something manageable. Now it waited for Elias Crowe to fail. People measured time in expectations. How long before the children were returned? How long before hunger showed on their faces? How long before the quiet man proved the town right? Eyes followed Elias whenever he came into town. Not openly, not cruelly, just enough to notice. The shopkeeper counted the children's heads twice. The preacher lingered longer after Sunday service. Neighbors spoke in softer voices when the orphans passed by. Samuel noticed it first. He stood taller in public, chin lifted, daring anyone to say aloud what they were thinking. He learned quickly where to position himself, always slightly in front of the younger children, always ready to intercept judgment meant for them. Elias noticed too. He adjusted without comment. He sent the children to the back of the store if stares lingered too long. He shortened their visits. He took on extra work so they wouldn't need help from anyone else. Pride, the town said again. But Elias knew better. He remembered how easily kindness could turn conditional. One afternoon, a woman stopped him outside the mercantile. Her tone was polite, careful. "You know," she said, glancing toward the children, "there are families better suited for this sort of thing. Married couples, women." Elias met her eyes. "They're suited where they are." She smiled thinly. "We'll see." The children heard every word. That night, one of them asked, "Do people want us gone?" Elias didn't lie. He never did. "Some do," he said. "It doesn't matter." "But what if they make you send us away?" another whispered. Elias looked around the room. The rough walls, the mended furniture, the small signs of effort layered over solitude. Then he knelt so they were all at eye level. "No one takes you from this house," he said. "Not while I'm standing." The certainty in his voice startled even him. The town's patience thinned as the weeks passed. They waited for raised voices. For bruises hidden beneath sleeves. For hunger sharp enough to force intervention. None came. The children grew steadier, cleaner, stronger. That unsettled dry creak more than failure would have. Because it suggested something dangerous, that Elias Crowe was not broken beyond repair. That love could take root in places no one expected. That the town had been wrong. And towns like Dry Creek did not like being wrong. So they waited still, hoping for disaster to restore order. They didn't know it was already on its way. The first laugh came by accident. It startled all of them, including Elias. He had been trying to fix a broken toy, a small wooden horse missing one leg. His hands, steady with tools meant for survival, were clumsy with something meant only for joy. When he set the toy down, it tipped sideways and collapsed completely. For a moment, the room went still. Then one child laughed, a sharp, surprised sound, as if it had escaped before permission was granted. Another joined in. Soon the laughter spread, tentative at first, then fuller, louder. Elias froze. And then, slowly, he laughed too. The sound felt foreign in his chest, like a muscle long unused. It broke free without warning and left him blinking in disbelief. The children stared at him, eyes wide, as if they had discovered something precious and fragile. From that moment on, something shifted. Mornings became easier, not peaceful, never peaceful, but easier. The children began to argue openly, to complain, to make messes without flinching at every mistake. They stopped whispering at night. They stopped asking if they would have to leave. Elias began to learn their rhythms. Samuel was protective to a fault, always watching the horizon for danger. Elias started giving him real responsibilities, not to burden him, but to show trust. The boy responded by loosening his grip on the younger ones, just a little. The middle children discovered their own strengths. One could mend clothing better than most adults. Another had a head full of questions and a laugh that came without effort now. The youngest grew bold enough to scold Elias when he forgot to rest. One night, the smallest fell asleep against Elias's chest by the fire. Her breathing evened out, warm and steady. Elias didn't move. He didn't dare. He stared at the flames until they burned low, afraid that if he shifted, the moment would vanish. He understood then that this was not temporary. This was not charity or obligation. This was family, formed not by blood, but by choice and endurance. The town noticed the change. The children walked differently now. Heads up, laughter unguarded. They no longer looked like they were waiting for someone to take them away. That unsettled people. "You're getting attached," someone warned Elias one day. "That's dangerous." Elias nodded. He already knew. Because attachment meant loss was possible. But it also meant something else, something worth risking everything for. That night, after the children were asleep, Elias sat alone by the dying fire. He listened to the sounds of the house, breathing, shifting blankets, the faint creak of wood settling. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full. And Elias Crowe realized he would burn the world down before he let anyone take this from him. The summer came in dry and relentless. Weeks passed without rain, the land cracking under the sun, grass turning brittle and pale. Even the wind felt sharper, as if it carried heat instead of relief. Elias noticed it first in the way the horses grew restless and the air smelled faintly of ash long before smoke ever appeared. Dry Creek had seen dry seasons before. But this one felt different. One evening, the wind shifted without warning. It came hard from the west, hot and fast, bending the grasses low and rattling loose boards. Elias stood outside, scanning the horizon as the sky dimmed to a strange copper hue. He smelled smoke. Not close, but close enough. He ushered the children inside, his voice calm despite the tension tightening his chest. He barred the door, checked the windows, then stepped back outside. In the distance, a thin line of dark cloud rose unnaturally fast. Fire. By the time he reached the barn, ash was already falling like black snow. The wind carried sparks ahead of the flames, leaping fences and devouring dry brush in seconds. Elias ran. He didn't waste time on belongings. He didn't think of himself. He ran straight for the house. Inside, the children had woken. Fear cut through the room sharp and immediate. Elias moved quickly, lifting the smallest into his arms, guiding the others toward the door. "Stay close," he said, "no matter what." The wind howled. Smoke seeped in through the cracks in the walls. Flames crested the nearby hill, rolling toward the house faster than Elias had ever seen fire move before. He got 3 children outside before the heat became unbearable. Then the roof groaned. A beam collapsed inside with a sound like thunder. One of the children screamed. Elias turned back without hesitation. The smoke was thick now, blinding, burning his lungs with every breath. He found one child huddled beneath the table, frozen in terror. He lifted them and ran, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of heat and sound. Outside, he set the child down and turned back again. Someone grabbed his arm. "No," Samuel shouted, "you can't." Elias pulled free. There was still one inside. The house was already burning by the time he crossed the threshold again. Flames climbed the walls, devouring everything they touched. The air itself seemed alive, roaring, furious. Elias moved on instinct alone. He found the last child near the back wall, curled tight, coughing, barely conscious. He scooped them up, shielding their face with his own body as he turned toward the door. The fire answered with a crash. The roof collapsed. Elias ran. He burst from the house and fell into the dirt, rolling to smother the flames that had caught his sleeve. The world spun. Smoke filled his chest. Pain screamed through his arms and back. The children surrounded him, crying, shouting his name. Behind them, the house burned, every memory, every small sign of belonging swallowed by fire. Elias closed his eyes, breath ragged. He had gotten them out. That was enough. The fire did not slow once the house was taken. It roared past the remains of the roof and surged toward the fields beyond, a living thing driven by wind and hunger. Embers swirled through the air, settling into the children's hair and clothes like falling stars. The night glowed orange, brighter than any sunrise Elias Crowe had ever seen. Elias lay in the dirt, breath tearing from his lungs in short, painful gasps. His arms burned, his back burned, every inch of him screamed in protest, but he did not move. He could not. The world narrowed to sound and heat and the weight of small bodies pressing close. The children cried openly now. Samuel knelt beside him, shaking, his hands hovering uselessly over Elias's burned sleeve. He didn't know where it was safe to touch. His jaw clenched tight as tears cut lines through the soot on his face. "You promised," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "You said no one would take us." Elias forced his eyes open. "No one did," he whispered. The words cost him more than he could afford, but he needed them to hear it. Needed them to know. The town arrived too late. By the time Dry Creek's men reached the hill, the house was already gone. They stood at a distance, powerless, watching the flames carve a path across land they thought they understood. Buckets were useless. Shovels barely slowed the advance. And there, in the dirt, lay the man they had doubted. The preacher was the first to kneel. He tore off his coat and pressed it against Elias's burned arm, his hands trembling. He went back in, someone said. More than once, another answered quietly. The realization settled heavy and unforgiving. The children refused to move from Elias's side. Even when hands tried to lift him, they clung tighter, as if the world itself might pull him away if they loosened their grip. "He's not dead," one of the men said, checking his pulse. "Barely, but he's breathing." Relief rippled through the crowd, followed by something deeper and more uncomfortable. Shame. They had waited for this man to fail. They had watched, judged, whispered. And when the moment came, the moment that mattered, Elias Crowe had done what none of them had expected. He had run into fire. As the flames finally moved on, leaving ruin and smoke behind, Elias lost consciousness. His body gave in at last, surrendering to pain and exhaustion. The children huddled together, soot-stained and shaking, but alive. And for the first time since Elias had walked them out of the church weeks earlier, Dry Creek was silent. No laughter. No judgment. Only the crackle of dying flames and the truth no one could deny anymore. The town gathered at the edge of the hill as the smoke curled skyward, carrying the scent of charred wood and ash. They had come running, not out of hope, but curiosity. The men and women of Dry Creek had waited for proof that Elias Crowe's gamble had failed. Instead, they found him lying in the dirt, soot covering his face, burns streaking his arms and hands. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, but he was alive. And around him, 5 children clung like lifelines, wide-eyed and trembling, yet unharmed. No one laughed. No one whispered judgment. For once, the town could only stare. The preacher stepped forward first, stepping over fallen beams and still smoking debris. He lowered himself beside Elias, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You went in, after them," the preacher said, voice thick with awe and disbelief. Elias forced a shaky nod, his lips pressed tight against the soot covering them. "All of them," he rasped. "No one gets left behind." The crowd murmured among themselves, faces pale under the fire-lit sky. They had thought the man incapable of love, incapable of courage, incapable of building something lasting. And yet, here he was, the living proof that judgment had been wrong. Samuel knelt beside his father figure, eyes still wide. "We're safe," he said softly, as if speaking aloud would somehow make it real. "Yes," Elias whispered, "we're safe." The smallest girl tugged at his sleeve. "Did the house?" He shook his head. "Gone. But we have each other. That's what matters." Slowly, townsfolk approached. Some carried blankets. Others brought water. A few offered tools and hands to help tend to the children in Elias's burns. The shift was quiet at first, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Respect, not pity, had replaced the skepticism that had shadowed him since the church that first day. For the first time, the town of Dry Creek saw the man they had mocked not as odd, not as broken, but as a hero. Though Elias never sought the title. He simply did what he had always done: protected the children, guided them, stayed. The wind, once sharp and unforgiving, now carried the soft scents of earth and wet grass. Smoke drifted lazily from the ruins, mingling with the warm night air. The children laughed again, small and relieved, as they clung to Elias and each other. Some in the crowd swallowed hard. Others nodded quietly, murmuring apologies they hadn't yet found the courage to speak aloud. One by one, they came closer, not to interfere, not to judge, but to witness the truth. A man had risked everything, walked into flames without hesitation, and emerged holding what was most precious. Elias, still on his knees, looked at the children, soot and ash streaked across their small faces. He felt the weight of their trust settle fully in his chest. This was family. They had survived together. They belonged together. The town could no longer doubt it. The night, once a backdrop for fear and judgment, now held something else. Awe, gratitude, and the quiet recognition that love, true, selfless love, could change everything. And for the first time in weeks, the world felt still. The sun rose over Dry Creek the next morning, casting pale gold across a town that had spent the night holding its breath. The charred remnants of Elias Crowe's house smoldered in the distance, blackened beams jutting from the earth like broken teeth. But the children were safe, wrapped in blankets and pressed close to the man who had saved them all. The townsfolk came slowly, unsure how to approach. Some carried food, stale bread and jars of water. Others brought cloth to clean soot from small hands. Men and women who had whispered judgment the day before now whispered apologies they hadn't yet found the courage to speak aloud. The preacher stepped forward first. "Elias?" His voice faltered. "I was wrong." Elias looked at him, soot on his cheeks, exhaustion written in every line of his body. He nodded quietly, too tired to speak. Words were unnecessary. Actions had already said everything. One by one, others approached. A neighbor whose children Elias had once watched quietly nodding in approval said, "We judged you too harshly." A storekeeper, hands shaking, laid a small basket of supplies at Elias's feet. We should have helped." The children clung to Elias. Samuel, still wary, whispered, "Are they really here to help?" Elias lifted him slightly, brushing ash from his hair. "They are," he said. "It doesn't erase what they said before, but it's a start." Even the youngest, whose tears had seemed endless the night before, pressed her small hand against his arm. Elias felt the warmth of trust again, mingled with the sting of minor burns, and allowed himself the smallest smile. It wasn't charity that drew the town closer. It was respect. It was the recognition that Elias Crowe had risked everything, his life, his comfort, his solitude, for children that were not his by blood. And in doing so, he had shown them a courage they could never take lightly. By mid-morning, a rough plan had begun to take shape. The townsfolk would help rebuild, not because they were asked, not because they owed him, but because they wanted to witness the family thrive. Tools were gathered, timber unloaded, and by day's end, laughter and labor mixed. The sound of hammering and sawing replaced the distant crackle of flames, a soundtrack of hope instead of fear. Elias watched it all from a small distance, the children at his side. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. What mattered was their safety, their belonging, their smiles that could now bloom without fear. As the days stretched on, the town began to understand something essential. The man they had doubted, laughed at, and dismissed had been teaching them all along. He had been showing them the value of courage, of loyalty, and of unconditional love. Elias rested for a moment, the youngest in his arms, Samuel leaning against his side. Around them, Dry Creek was beginning to change, not immediately, not fully, but it had begun. And that was enough. For the first time in a long while, Elias Crowe allowed himself to believe that the past could be left behind, and that the family he had forged from ashes could survive anything. Weeks passed, and slowly a new home rose where ashes had once lain. Timber was stacked carefully, beams joined with purpose, and walls grew strong enough to hold not just a roof, but the laughter of a family reborn. The town of Dry Creek worked alongside Elias, not because they expected reward, but because they had finally learned what it meant to witness courage firsthand. Elias stood on the porch one golden afternoon, watching his children run barefoot through the tall grass. Samuel led the way, protective yet proud, while the younger ones chased each other in reckless, joyous circles. The youngest girl twirled under the sun, hair catching light like fire, a little echo of the night that had once terrified them all. The town's people passed quietly behind him, acknowledging the family with soft smiles or gentle nods. No more laughter, no more derision, just the silent recognition that Elias Crowe, the man they had mocked, had built something unshakable. Calm settled over the land in a way that felt foreign yet deserved. Elias's hands were still scarred, reminders of the fire that had tried to claim them, but the pain had become proof that love and action could withstand even the fiercest blaze. He crouched to tie a loose bootlace on the smallest child and glanced up. The horizon glowed with the soft warmth of sunset. Smoke from distant fires drifted lazily, harmless now, a reminder of what they had survived together. The children called him Pa, now without hesitation, without fear, without the uncertainty that had shadowed their first weeks. Their voices rang out, a chorus of trust, belonging, and resilience. Elias could feel their happiness as tangibly as the wind on his face. He straightened, brushing dirt from his coat, and looked at the land that had once seemed so lonely, so hostile. He saw opportunity now, space to grow, and love that could expand as endlessly as the prairie stretching beyond the horizon. This was their world together, fragile, Yes, but theirs. And no fire, no town, no whispering voice could take it away. Elias's gaze shifted to Samuel, who had paused mid-run to glance back at him, eyes wide and filled with admiration. He smiled, realizing that this boy, who had once held himself so tightly in fear, had learned what trust could feel like. Then he watched the others tumble through the grass, laughing, chasing each other, their voices lifting toward the sky in pure, untamed joy. The sun dipped lower, and Elias wrapped his arms around the youngest. He felt the steady rhythm of their hearts against his own, a pulse that told him he had succeeded where others had doubted, where fire had threatened, where the world had whispered that he was unfit. No, the world had not won. The fire had not won. And neither had fear. Elias Crowe rose, the children at his side, and together they faced the vast, open land stretching out before them. For the first time, he understood that family wasn't measured by blood, nor by opinion, nor by the walls of a house. It was measured by choice, courage, and the willingness to stay. And they had stayed. Together. Unbroken. A family that no fire, no whisper, no shadow of doubt could ever touch again.